I remember the day clearly. It was a Sunday morning in the spring of 2014. I was in my last semester of getting my associate's degrees at the ripe young age of 21. I was participating in my Sunday morning ritual before church, watching a show that I'd been following since I was 13, and enjoying my morning cup of hot chocolate, because I hate coffee, so it's got to be hot chocolate. So, of course, hot chocolate is in front of me, not coffee. Yeah, still hate coffee to this day. But I had that in front of me, and it was great. And I was enjoying my morning, getting ready for church, but also enjoying the show. And I happened to spill my hot chocolate on top of my laptop just a couple of weeks before midterms. And that moment broke me. Not because I lost a laptop, although that was definitely part of it, realizing that my world was crumbling around me, but because it was a straw that broke the camel's back. I hated my job. I didn't want to continue to get a degree in business and pursue that world. I just got dumped from a relationship that was tumultuous as all get out. I was living with my parents thinking that I would never move out, never make enough to do it, and I still had no idea what I was going to do with my life. I went to church that morning, proceeded to sit in my normal seat, and spend the entire service weeping, bawling my eyes out, wondering what was going on and what was God doing, because I could not see it with my own eyes. And the simple prayer I prayed that day through the whole service was, God, I don't know what to do, but I will do whatever you ask. Toward the end of service, I heard a very small voice, very quiet, very still, that said to me, maybe you are to be a pastor. At the moment, I wasn't having it. I was tired, upset, and crying, and I didn't care, and so I put it off a little bit, but I later came back to that thought multiple times. And over the next couple of weeks, I did my own little mini discernment period, which that's its own story, which is really cool. But it eventually led me to my senior pastor's office, where I told him about this call I was feeling and what God was calling me into, and if he could pray for me and what wisdom he had and what advice. And he said, okay, Blake, I'll pray for you. I'll get back to you in a couple weeks. We'll talk more about this when that happens. Within about 3 hours, I got a message from my pastor saying something along the lines of, Blake, I rarely hear from God this clearly and this fast. You are called to be a pastor. I love you and I will support you in everything you do. Blessings. And from there, I started my journey to becoming a pastor and eventually into a priest in the Anglican Church. I tell you the story of my calling into ministry because without it, I wouldn't be here. And through many times in my life, I look back to that moment and that story and think about it to remind me of the calling that God has given me on great days and on bad days. And many pastors I know also have that same kind of moment where they felt this calling that they could not explain themselves, and maybe even others saw it in them, into ministry. So today we're going to continue our series on this that I've been labeling the heartbeat of Paul by going through 1 Timothy together. And I want us to consider the call that God has on some people in ministry, to be priests, to be deacons, to be bishops. This is important on a personal level, on a corporate level, and again, a cosmic level. It affects everything and everyone. And as a priest, I can say it's hard to go through this with a congregation. Because basically what I'm doing is I'm saying, I'm going to lay myself on an operating table and I want you to examine me to the criteria in which Scripture is giving me and giving you all to say, is this person called into ministry? I've made it this far, so I think I'm okay. But at the same time, it always is a question that should be in the minds of people, because there are criteria in which a pastor has to live up to. And hopefully, when we get finished with this letter, we'll have a clear understanding of what pastoral ministry is and is not, and also a better understanding of holy orders. Why do we have bishops and priests and deacons? So in order to do that, though, we need to get a little bit of context to 1 Timothy, as we're going to be spending a few weeks in this book. 1 Timothy is one of 3 pastoral epistles or letters that's grouped together. The other two letters are 2 Timothy and Titus. All of them are written by Paul. There is some debate about that, but for now we're just going to say it is written by Paul. But Paul is addressing both Timothy and Titus as children. That when he writes these letters, he's saying, my children, do these things and live this way. And just like it's the job of a parent to raise a child in the way they ought to go, it's Paul's duty to raise up Timothy and Titus in the way they ought to go as priests. That they put themselves under Paul and listen to his teaching and authority so that they might know, what does it mean to be a priest? What does it mean to have this calling in their life? It's not just the job of anyone to raise a priest or a pastor. It must be someone with authority over them that has lived that role. Even Paul, after he got called by Jesus and knocked off his horse, spent 3 years learning the way of Jesus, understanding who he is, all under the tutelage of Peter. He sat himself under an apostle so he too might understand, what does it mean to be an apostle? And this is why, again, it's not the primary job of a congregation or an academic institution, and maybe even not a denomination as a whole, to raise up a priest or a pastor. Those things are important. They are essential in the process, but it's not the responsibility of them. It's the responsibility of another pastor, priest, or bishop over that priest to raise them up. The institutions are important. They teach us theology. They help us to study and to learn. Having pastoral classes under other professors who are pastors, or even walking alongside in my own journey at Living Faith, being next to Peter, rubbing shoulders as we're dealing with pastoral difficulties and challenges within our church and how to solve them. In a lot of ways, I found myself being shepherded by him. The second thing about this letter is that the contents of the letter point to the reality of those who are teaching in the faith. It's always been the responsibility of the presbyters and bishops to teach the faith. This is made clear throughout all these letters in various ways, and ones that we see here at the beginning and many that we'll see later on in this letter. And we'll even spend time understanding what is the role of a bishop in this when we get to chapter 3 and we have the conversation there. Paul's writing this letter to these men as a way of training them and raising them up in their role, but also to let churches know what to look for in someone who is called to this work. It's inescapable that the Christian faith depends on accountability to one another and ultimately to God for the things that we teach and that we do. That you cannot just be a rogue individual in this world. That's not how God's kingdom works. God's kingdom works with a layer of accountability. And there's much to be said about this letter. Before we get too deep into it, let me just back up really quick and let's start with the text again. Let's look at verses 3 and 4. Verse 3 says this, "As I urged you when I was going to Macedonia, remain at Ephesus, so that you may charge certain persons not to teach any different doctrine, nor to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies, which promote speculations rather than the stewardship from God that is by faith." Paul, after introducing himself to the church that is probably at Ephesus and reading this aloud, is then telling to Timothy and giving him clear instructions on there are those who can teach and those who should not teach. That there are those who are instructed and taught and learned the way and those who have not been. We have to remember the church at the time that Paul is writing this is much like a newborn baby. It's very fragile. It has to be nurtured and cared for well so that it might mature. Because when you think about it, like how does even Christianity last for 2,000 years if not for faith and care of souls for generation after generation after generation? And so that means those who teach had to be spot on about who Jesus is and what the faith is. Very easily, it could have been taken on by other theology or other ways of living that could have steered the church in a terrible way, and we would have lost faith and lost Jesus. He's the one sustaining it, so it never would have happened in the first place. But the reason we have the Nicene Creed is because of some of these heresies that pop up very early in the church. And so Paul, wherever he went, what he had to do then was to raise up presbyters or priests to be able to withhold and carry and stand and maintain that community of believers in that place. All throughout Acts, when you're reading about his journeys, they went there, they laid hands, and they appointed the presbyters to be in that place. He went to another place and then laid hands and appointed presbyters to be in that place, or as the ESV translates it, elders. Right? Wherever he went, he had to appoint people to guard the faith and to teach the faith and to raise up people in the faith to do that. That way, as he went from city to city, he could leave knowing that this church would hopefully find its way and be found in the faith. The Corinthians had more problem than the Colossians, right? Than those at Colossae, right? They found themselves wandering, but all the time Paul is checking and bringing in the rails of what does it mean to follow Jesus or not. And Timothy is one of those people. Timothy's first charge, do not let certain people teach. Timothy was to protect the faith that was given to him in Ephesus. As we talked about before, the early Christians found themselves between a rock and a hard place. On one side, they had this dualistic way of living where all gods were accepted, that they might be worshipped, even one God, but they could worship one among many. And they can just accept them in and bring them in, almost like you would bring in little trinkets into your home and let it continue to gather. That's called henotheism. And at the same time, you have this immense Jewish presence that was focused on the Messiah, constantly on the lookout, who would come to liberate them from the powers and principalities of the world, which at the time was believed of the Romans. And you have these two pressures trying to tell Christians how to live, how they ought to worship, how they should worship, and who they should worship. That actually Jesus wasn't the Messiah, so worship Yahweh over here. Or Jesus is just one of many gods, so just add him to the collection. These pressures cause extreme difficulties for the early church. And those pressures would cause people to ignore the fundamental virtue of the Christian life, which is faith. In our next verse, it nails down and it hits the heart of what Paul is trying to tell Timothy, and what I think is one of the most clear understandings of what does it mean to be a priest in God's kingdom. Paul tells Timothy this in verse 5. He says, "The aim of our charge is love that issues from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith." The aim of our charge is love that issues from a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith. This one sentence opens up Paul's heart to Timothy, but all those who are called into the role of being a pastor or a priest, that they should live by, that they should be people of love that issued from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. I love what commentator Donald Guthrie reveals about these three characteristics in his commentary. He says this: the word heart stands for the totality of man's moral affections, and without purity there, nobility of character is clearly impossible. Nobility of character is clearly impossible. A priest or a pastor must have a pure heart. Conscience indicates literally joint knowledge, and came to be used of the faculty to distinguish between right and wrong. Again, the priests and presbyters in their places are meant to stand in the gap to help lead people in the right and the wrong. And faith, which is merely a pretense without solid foundation, may well have been evident in the false teachers. What was important was the genuineness of what was professed. Anyone who's a part of a church should find a pastor who at the very core represents this triad of virtues: the pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith. It is those three things that leads a pastor to shepherd their congregation and their people well. When I was getting my bachelor's degree, my class was filled with all sorts of people. I went to Biola, there's like 3,000 people in undergrad there. Even though it's a small university, it was a large non-denominational Christian university. But I would sit in my classes and I would look around and I would ask, why, in my head, just why are you here? Why are you here? See, as I got to know these people more and more and more, there was this discord in my heart about their character and heart for ministry, and the things that they were saying. There was something off, but I couldn't say anything. I mean, I'm just a peer in the classroom, and so I couldn't really do anything. And if I said it, it's like, okay, Blake, well, who cares? I'm going to go get a job anyway. Fast forward almost 10 years, and I look at those people. Several have denied Christianity. One has gone down the path of gender transition. Others had left the pursuit of being a pastor for material wealth or gain. And if I dug around long enough, I'm sure the list would go on and on and on about these people. It was clearly evident in my own sight that the words you're saying and the things I'm sensing from the Spirit, and these things aren't aligning. And yet they didn't have any authority over them. They didn't have anyone covering them. And so when I talk about the institutions that have been given us the ability to have bachelor's or master's degrees, those are not enough to say who is a pastor and not a pastor. And I don't say this just to say, oh, look, I'm so much better than them, so follow me, right? I don't do that. I tell you these stories because you all, King's Cross, are responsible for helping us raise up leaders. In the Anglican way of discerning people for holy orders, there are two parts that the person has to go through first. One is the rector's discernment. I have to sit down with this person. I have to talk to them about holy orders to make sure that I understand what their heart is, to know if I can bring them on to you, the congregation, who forms a team of people to ask the hard questions of this person, that they too might go through a trial to see if they are called into ordination. This is a beautiful model in the Anglican Church. I know several people who don't even get bachelor's degrees anymore in other denominations. All they have to do is say, I believe in Jesus and I want to lead youth ministry. It's like, okay, you got a pulse, let's go. That's all they care about. But the discernment begins in the Anglican Church here in this room, sitting across the table from somebody else. It looks like our congregation pointing to someone and saying, hey, maybe you are called to be a pastor. And that person saying, hey, maybe I am called. Father, would you sit with me and help me discern? Some of you may even be asked to sit on that team to be praying intentionally to determine if someone is called into holy orders or not. And you haven't failed God if that priest fails along the way. It's not about you. It is about what God is doing and listening to Him well. And although the process starts with me, right? Again, it goes through you guys. And here's why. Paul gets into it in the next two verses, starting in verse 6. Certain persons, by swerving from these, have wandered away into vain discussion, desiring to be teachers of the law without understanding either what they are saying or the things about which they make confident assertions. As Paul warns teachers who do not live with pure hearts, a good conscience, and a sincere faith, they will fall trap to vain discussions, only caring about the law. My friends who have now left the faith entirely were really good at giving the right answers in class. And yet they fell to vain teaching and discussion. These kinds of people, they care more about every I being dotted and every T being crossed, rather than letting Christ work in them and through them in the moment for what they need then and there. For people like this, it becomes more about the outcomes than it becomes about faithfulness. If you read your Bible for this long, then you're a real Christian. If you pray for this long, then you're a real Christian. If you bring 5 people to Christ every year, you are a real Christian. Instead, the questions we should ask are you being a good husband or wife? And are you laying down your life? Are you seeking God every day? Doesn't matter how. Are you listening? Are you seeking Him? Are you drawing near to Him every day? Are you proclaiming the kingship of Jesus to everyone you meet? In the grocery store, in the library, at the gas station, wherever you go, are you proclaiming the kingship? Your life is about being faithful. For people who fall into vain discussion, it becomes more about the personality than about being personable. To be a personality asks the questions, do I look like a Christian? Do you have the right kind of tattoos or Instagram presence or clothes or etc.? Do you fit the vibe? Do you say the right things in front of the right people? Instead, pastors and people there should be more personable. Do you love your neighbor and do you know their name? Do you pray for your enemy? Do you give to the poor when no one is looking, or do you only talk about it when you stand up in front of everyone? When a person who falls and wanders into vain discussions, they start to speak of things they've read about rather than the things they've experienced. Did you read this book? Or I read this book about homelessness, or I read this thing about the refugees, or I read this about the early church fathers, or I have all the theological knowledge I need about here, and I went to this conference. It becomes a status thing. Instead, pastors should look at their lives and say, have I offered my place to someone in need? Have I closed my doors and locked them and kept the strangers out? Have I kept the sinners out of my home? Or have I welcomed them into the table just like Jesus did? Have I served the lost and the outcast without anyone knowing? Do I regularly participate in that work despite of my orders or not? Do I help the elderly when they're in need? If a pastor is not rooted in a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith, they will lead astray the people that they've been asked to lead. They will make them wander down those ways in which look good to be a Christian, but not actually live the life of Christ wherever they go. Paul then finishes this first part of Timothy in verses 8 through 11, talking about what the law is good for. I'll start at verse 8. Now we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, understanding this, that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and the profane, for those who strike their fathers and mothers, for murderers, the sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, enslavers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine, in accordance with the gospel of the glory of the blessed God, with which I have been entrusted. Paul knew and understood that he was entrusted with the good news to proclaim it to the world wherever he went. And that his role in finding someone to lay his hands on and to appoint an elder, a priest, a presbyter in a particular place was to also uphold those things that have been entrusted. If priests are going to be appointed, they're going to need to understand the reason for the law and how to use it. But they also must know what they are entrusted with and how to protect it. They must not put in restrictions in a community that would prevent people from worshiping God or living in a way that would honor Him. But this is a problem. This becomes a problem in our modern context, but as long as Christianity has been around, we've tried to define what makes a Christian. And we do that through many different ways, through our denominations, an Anglican, a Roman, a Catholic, a Baptist, a Pentecostal, a non-denominational. But the early church wasn't concerned about that. They didn't have all of these denominations in place. Instead, they had to find themselves gathering around who Jesus really was and what the gospel really is. And this is why I constantly remind people that I am first trying to disciple Christians. Then they become Anglicans. This is just the way we worship. But when we leave, we are Christians to the world. You are the priesthood, as Peter talks about. That we are to proclaim the light of Christ wherever we go in his kingship. With a sincere faith, I hope to lead this congregation. I hope to continue to disciple you and draw you into Christ that he might continue to make us whole again. And don't get me wrong, the Anglican way can make us become a better Christian. It can. It can transform us and give us rhythm and structure to our life, but it does not define what being a Christian is. Paul wanted to make sure that Timothy knew how to use the law and how to draw the boundaries for the church and where they needed to be. We're supposed to be ordered people. We're supposed to be a people that worship God, but according to his kingdom and not ours. This is the work of a priest, to help people worship God and live as members of his kingdom. To help people worship God and live as members of his kingdom. This is almost always the call of Paul in his letters. He wanted his people to live into their identity as sons and daughters of God. That means equipping people to live out their faith in the totality of their life, at work, at home, in their city, at church, and wherever they might find themselves. And who is to help them do that? It's the job of the priest. Paul would not live forever in this world, and he knew that. So if the church were to grow, he had to entrust people to give them authority for teaching, and on the list goes until today. The work of a priest is to help people worship God and to live as members of his kingdom. It's through that work. It's through that work that we begin to understand, what does it mean to be drawn into his kingdom? What does it mean to live into that? And it's my job to help you see that. As we continue to work through 1 Timothy in the next few weeks, I want you to consider two things. Well, ask two things. One, pray for me. Pray for me. This is a hard job. I love you all, and I do, and I want to see you continue to grow in your faith. I want to continue to see you grow in wisdom and character, to be able to evangelize and proclaim the gospel to the world, and also to know, well, how do we do that in September of 2025 in Tucson, Arizona, or Oro Valley, Arizona? How do we do that here today? That I might have wisdom and insight to gain from that. The second thing is to ask you to pray about your own life and the priesthood you bear. We'll talk more about this in our Instructed Eucharist in October, but I believe that you all are the priests of this world. That when you go out into your businesses and to your places of work, you are to bless and consecrate those places that others might see the light of Christ wherever you go. So what does it look like to be a priest there? What does it look like to be a priest in your home, at your work, at the grocery store, with your neighbor? Pray with me in those ways. And lastly, pray for deacons. Pray for priests. God is calling people into those roles regularly, and he wants to care and order his kingdom and his church so that they might be blessed. We need more. We need more priests. We need more deacons. We need more people to step up into these roles that have been around for centuries. Look out for them. Ask questions. Pray earnestly for them, that God would bring us and raise up people for that work.